Hello and welcome to African Elements. In this video, I'm going to talk about slavery versus indentured servitude. What's the difference? Why was there such a gradual transformation from one institution to the other? And what does race have to do with it? Let's jump into that right now. Thank you for watching African Elements. If you're new to this channel, we develop Africana Studies content for the classroom and give it to the people. Unlike many other disciplines, Africana Studies is a collaborative process, so be sure to stick around to the end for our question of the day so that you can share your insights. As we saw in a previous video, slavery has been practiced in one form or another by many civilizations throughout history. We also learned, however, that the Atlantic slave trade represents a radical departure from the historical practice of slavery. Historically, the practice of slavery has typically involved the expansion of one group as they conquer and enslave their neighbors. But in this context, race was more or less incidental. The Egyptians, Romans, Greeks, and even Native Americans each enslaved a variety of different people, but no one particular racial group was specifically targeted or singled out for slave status. The advent of the Atlantic slave trade brought about a radical transformation in which race became the defining factor in determining who was slave and who was free. Additionally, the era of the Atlantic slave trade no longer functioned as a means to assimilate a population, but to specifically single out a population. Slave status could now be passed down to one's children and one's children's children, and so on. In 1619, the English warship White Lion entered Point Comfort in the English colony of Jamestown, which eventually was absorbed into the colony of Virginia. They arrived with a cargo that included some 20 captured Africans. The African captives began their hellish journey along with some 350 others who had been kidnapped from their present-day villages in Angola and forced onto a Portuguese slave ship. By the time they arrived in Veracruz, Mexico, only 147, less than half, had survived the Middle Passage. But their ordeal was just beginning. The survivors were then stolen and divided amongst English pirates, among whom around 20 were taken to Jamestown Colony on August 20th, 1619, where they were traded for food. There's been much debate over the status of those African arrivals. Did they arrive as slaves or indentured servants? Their status wasn't clear. The main reason for the lack of clarity here is that in the early 1600s, slavery had no clearly defined legal definition. It was an ambiguous term for an institution that was not yet fully developed conceptually. As such, there was little distinction between slaves and indentured servants. Consistent with a system of slavery and servitude throughout human history, ethnic European servants of the Old World consisted of poor and conquered people. The notion of race had not yet developed as a factor in this form of servitude in the early colonial American history. Prior to the early 1600s, racial terms such as white and black had little social meaning. In fact, as we saw in a previous episode, the concept of race is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history, emerging only within the past 400 years. During the period that predated social constructs of blackness and whiteness as we understand them today, Europe had a turbulent history of war, conquest, and enslavement going all the way back to Roman times. In other words, before slavery became racially based, Europeans essentially enslaved other Europeans. In fact, the very word slave originates from the Holy Roman Empire's conquest and enslavement of Slavic peoples in the 9th century. The relationship between Europe's various warring groups remained turbulent into the fairly recent past. In fact, England's first venture into the colonial era didn't take place in Africa nor the Americas, but in Ireland. It was there that England developed the concept of a plantation colony, and that concept would be extended throughout an empire that would eventually include Africa, Australia, India, and other parts of Asia, and of course, the Americas. The English conquest and colonization of the Irish brought with it centuries of hostility between England and Ireland. Additionally, with England's harsh colonial treatment of its Irish subjects, an ideology of supremacy soon developed that would later be applied to other groups as a justification for English domination over its colonial subjects. Edmund S. Morgan, author of American Slavery, American Freedom, The Ordeal of Colonial Virginia, writes that in the eyes of the English, the Irish were clearly the wrong kind of people. In the English view, they were barbarous, only nominally Christian, and generally intractable. The English view of superiority over their subjects accompanied colonial policies guided by the economic principle of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the underlying principle that colonies exist solely for the benefit of the mother country. What the English needed from its colonial subjects in Ireland was wool for clothing, and it was England's need for wool that brought about a colonial policy known as the Enclosure Movement. So, while the way in which the Irish organized their land had worked for them for countless generations prior to English colonization, colonization transformed Irish society by enclosing the old Irish manners that used to form the basis of food production to promote the herding of sheep. Remember here that the concept of mercantilism dictates that colonies exist solely for the benefit of the mother country, so the enclosure movement was never intended to be for the benefit of the Irish. The process of enclosure, accompanied by force, resistance, and bloodshed, pushed the Irish off their ancestral homelands. They then flooded the streets of London, jobless and homeless, where they were arrested wholesale and imprisoned as vagrants. From their prison cells, their debts to society were purchased in exchange for 7 years of indentured servitude in the Americas. Some historians, such as Professor Ron Takaki, author of A Different Mirror, A Multicultural History of the United States, have argued that the export of these Irish immigrants was coercive at best. But Dr. Takaki goes as far as to refer to their forced migration as a wholesale kidnapping. After they were purchased for 7 years of service, they were crammed into ships headed for the Americas on a voyage in which they were subject to dysentery, pregnant women suffered miscarriage, and many died horrible deaths en route. If the experience of the poor white and Irish indentured servants sounds familiar, it should. The similarity between their experience and that of African captives of the Atlantic slave trade wasn't lost on the Irish. They recognized early on that while they didn't arrive on the same boat as the Africans, they arrived on a boat that looked like, felt like, and smelled much like the boats that the Africans arrived on. Court records of the period are rife with instances of collaboration between blacks, poor ethnic European, and Irish indentured servants. It wasn't uncommon for blacks and whites to run away and conspire in rebellions together. As Howard Zinn notes in A People's History of the United States, the very fact that laws had to be passed to forbid such relations indicates the strength of that tendency. A 1661 law was passed in Virginia that in case any English servant shall run away in the company of Negroes, he should have to give a special service of extra years to the master of the runaway Negro. Still, the Africans and Irish that were forced into servitude were treated differently almost from the outset. In another count recorded by Howard Zinn, 6 servants and a Negro started to run away. While the whites received lighter sentences, Emmanuel, the Negro, was to receive 30 stripes and to be burnt on the cheek with the letter R, and to work in shackle 1 year more as his master shall see cause. So what's the difference between black slavery and white indentured servitude? The answer essentially is time. The legal codification of laws that transformed indentured servitude between Africans and the Irish into an institution in which blacks exclusively were stamped with slave status was a gradual process. Partly driving that process was the fact that a typical term of indenture was 7 years. Coincidentally, between 1620 and 1640, the average life expectancy for imported black slaves was 7 years. While it took 10 years to recoup the cost of purchasing a slave, it wasn't until the 1670s, when the life expectancy of black slaves rose above 10 years, that lifetime servitude became an attractive option to indentured servitude. There was another factor that hastened the transformation from indentured servitude to lifetime slavery, but I'll discuss that in a later video. So for now, what are your thoughts? Why do you suppose blacks were stamped with slave status as opposed to the Irish? Would it have been in the interest of ethnic European immigrants to continue to forge alliances with blacks? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for watching African Elements, where we strive to develop content and create opportunities to make it easier for scholars to stay in the discipline. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreon members for supporting this work. If you're so inclined, you too can pledge a membership for ad-free content at the link below. Otherwise, a like and subscribe would also be appreciated. Until next time, I'll see you in the comments.